How did you accidentally destroy a marriage? My friend Violet asked me to file her baby's birth certificate while she recovered from C-section. She said to make sure I didn't let her husband Dylan see it because he was batshit about paperwork, and she didn't want him leaving her during recovery to file it. I was standing in line at the courthouse when Dylan walked in looking frantic. He rushed over saying Violet had sent him. My stomach dropped because Violet specifically said he'd be at the hospital all day. He reached for the envelope, but I instinctively pulled it back. Just give me the papers. He grabbed my wrist, not hard but firm enough to be uncomfortable. Other people in line were starting to stare. He let go and chuckled that he was just exhausted from the birth, but his eyes stayed locked on the envelope like it contained nuclear codes. The line moved forward and Dylan stayed right beside me, asking questions about whether Violet had seemed okay when she gave me the papers, if she'd said anything specific about the name. His phone kept buzzing and I saw texts from Violet asking where he was, why he'd left the hospital, was everything okay. He ignored them and moved closer to me, saying he really needed to check the forms for accuracy before filing. I said they were already sealed, but he said we could get new forms, no big deal, just open it real quick. An elderly woman behind us asked if everything was all right, and Dylan snapped at her to mind her own business. Security started paying attention to us. Dylan noticed and lowered his voice, but his hand kept twitching toward the envelope. He started talking about how hormonal women get after birth, how they make rash decisions, how Violet wasn't thinking clearly. The way he said it made my skin crawl. When we got closer to the window, Dylan tried bargaining with me. He offered me $100 just to let him peek at the form. When I said no, he offered $500, then $1,000. His desperation was scary because I couldn't understand why the name mattered so much unless he already suspected something. He kept saying, "We agreed on Luna. We've been calling her Luna for months. The nursery has Luna painted on the wall." Then he tried a different approach, pulling up photos on his phone of a beautifully decorated nursery with Luna spelled out in wooden letters above the crib. "Look what I built for her," he said, his voice breaking. "I spent 3 months on that room. The moon and stars I painted by hand. You're going to let her destroy our family over some postpartum crazy decision?" When I still wouldn't give him the envelope, he actually dropped to his knees right there in line, grabbing my hand, begging me to just let him see it, saying he was her father and had rights. People were filming us with their phones now. At the window, Dylan tried to step in front of me, but I was already handing the envelope to the clerk. Dylan was saying something about being the father, needing to verify information, but the clerk had already opened it and was reading. "Baby girl, born yesterday. Mother Violet Torres. Father Dylan Torres," she read, then paused at the name line. Her eyebrows went up slightly. Dylan leaned over the counter trying to see. "What's her name?" "We agreed on Luna. Luna Marie Torres." But the clerk was frowning, looking between the paper and Dylan. I could see Violet had filled it out in her distinct handwriting, the purple ink she always used. Dylan was getting agitated, his voice rising, demanding to know what his daughter's name was. Other people were backing away from us. The clerk asked Dylan to confirm he was the father, and he pulled out his ID, his hands shaking now. She looked at it, then at the paper again, then at me with this expression like she'd seen this drama before. "Ma'am, did the mother fill this out herself?" I nodded. Dylan was practically climbing over the counter now trying to see the paper. Security was starting to move toward us, hands on their radios. "Just tell me what name she wrote," Dylan pleaded, and there was something desperate in his voice that made me realize Violet hadn't just been worried about him wanting to do paperwork. She'd been hiding something specific. The clerk looked at me like she was asking permission, and I didn't know what to do, so I just shrugged. She turned the paper toward Dylan so he could read it, and I watched his face go from red to white to red again. His whole body went rigid. He stood there staring at the paper for what felt like forever, not moving, not even breathing. Then he made this sound like an animal in pain. The security guard stepped closer. Dylan's hands clenched into fists, and he turned to look at me with pure rage in his eyes. "Levi," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "She named our daughter Levi." He turned to me slowly. "That's her ex-boyfriend's name, the one who died last year. The one she told me meant nothing to her." His fist went through the wall beside my head as he screamed, "She's still in love with him." The security guard grabbed Dylan's arm and yanked him back while another guard stepped between us, his hand on his radio calling for backup. Dylan tried to push past them, but they held him firmly, telling him to calm down or they'd call the police. The clerk behind the counter was already stamping the birth certificate with quick, practiced movements, making it official before anyone could stop her. Dylan kept shouting about Levi, about being betrayed, about his daughter being named after a dead man, and people were backing away from him with their phones still recording. 2 more guards arrived and surrounded Dylan, moving him toward the exit while he twisted in their grip, his face red and tears streaming down his cheeks. The elderly woman from the line touched my shoulder gently and asked if I needed someone to walk me to my car, her eyes full of concern. I nodded because my legs felt like jelly, and my hands wouldn't stop shaking from how close his fist had come to my head. The guards had Dylan outside now, but I could still hear him yelling through the glass doors. My phone was buzzing in my pocket, and when I pulled it out with trembling fingers, I saw Violet's name on the screen. I typed out that Dylan knew about the name and hit send. 3 dots appeared immediately, then disappeared, then appeared again before her response came through just 3 words that made my stomach drop even further. The elderly woman stayed with me as we walked toward the exit, and through the windows I could see Dylan pacing by his car in the parking lot while security stood nearby watching him. One of the guards saw me coming and held up his hand for me to wait inside while he went to talk to Dylan. I watched them arguing, Dylan pointing at me through the glass and yelling something I couldn't hear but could guess from his angry gestures. The guard came back and said he'd escort me to my car and make sure I got out safely. We walked out together and Dylan immediately started toward us, but the other guards blocked him. He screamed that this wasn't over, that I helped Violet steal his daughter, that I destroyed his family. The guard stayed between us and walked me all the way to my car, waiting while I fumbled with my keys and got inside. I started the engine and pulled out of the parking spot, checking my mirrors constantly, expecting to see Dylan's car following me. My hands were shaking so bad I had to pull over 2 blocks away just to breathe and calm down enough to drive safely. I texted Violet asking what she wanted me to do now and waited for for her response. She sent back short messages asking me to go to their house and get her purple robe from the closet and the baby's going home outfit from the nursery. She didn't mention Dylan or the name or anything about what just happened, just practical requests like nothing was wrong. Something felt really off about how calm she seemed when her husband had just punched a wall and found out about the name. I drove to their house, using my spare key to get inside, and the silence felt heavy and wrong. The nursery door was open, and I could see the wooden letters spelling Luna on the wall, the hand-painted stars and moons Dylan had spent months creating. I found the going home outfit in the dresser, a tiny pink sleeper with matching hat and mittens. In their bedroom closet, I grabbed Violet's purple robe and noticed a box pushed behind some winter coats. I didn't mean to snoop, but it was partially open and I could see photos inside. I drove to the hospital with a bag of clothes, my mind racing with questions I didn't know how to ask. The maternity ward was quiet when I arrived, and I found Violet propped up in bed looking pale and exhausted from the C-section surgery. She wouldn't meet my eyes when I handed her the bag, just mumbled thanks and asked me to hold the baby while she changed into the robe. The baby was so tiny in my arms, wrapped in a hospital blanket with a little knit cap on her head. Her wristband said Baby Girl Torres with no first name written on it yet. Violet moved slowly, wincing as she shifted to put on the robe, and I could see the pain medication wasn't quite enough. When I finally worked up the courage to ask about the name, she looked at the baby in my arms and her eyes filled with tears. She told me quietly that during labor, when the pain was at its worst, she had this overwhelming memory of Levi and couldn't let go of him. She said the baby has his eyes, the same shape and color, and she knew Dylan would never understand why that mattered so much. She admitted she knew it was wrong, but in that moment of grief and pain and hormones, she couldn't write Luna, she just couldn't. I helped her with the first feeding, holding the bottle at the right angle while Violet guided my hands. The baby made soft sucking sounds, and her tiny fingers wrapped around mine as she ate. Violet's hands shook as she watched, and I realized she was terrified of what would happen next, of Dylan's reaction, of custody battles, of everything falling apart. I'm really curious about why Violet picked her friend instead of handling this herself if she knew it would be this explosive. Something about sending someone else to file such an important document while claiming Dylan would just be upset about paperwork seems off. We sat there in silence except for the baby's feeding sounds and the beeping of machines down the hall. Around 7 that evening, Dylan appeared in the doorway looking wrecked, his face puffy and red from crying, demanding to talk to Violet alone about their daughter. The nurse immediately stepped into the room and firmly told him all visitors needed to remain calm or they'd have to leave. Dylan gripped the doorframe so hard I could see his knuckles turning white as he tried to control himself. The nurse pressed a button on the wall and spoke quietly into the intercom, requesting assistance in room 314. Within minutes, an older woman arrived carrying a folder and wearing a hospital badge that said, Gita Allison, Social Services. She had this calm presence that immediately changed the energy in the room, and she asked Dylan to step into the hallway with her for a moment. The second he was out of sight, Violet started crying hard, her whole body shaking as she held the baby against her chest. Gita came back after about 15 minutes and asked to speak with each of us separately about what had happened today. She interviewed me first in a small conference room, taking detailed notes about the courthouse incident, asking specific questions about the wall punch and whether I felt threatened. She documented everything carefully in her folder, writing down exact quotes and times, making sure she had all the facts straight before moving on to interview Violet. Gita came back 20 minutes later and sat down with Violet and Dylan separately, her folder now thick with notes from our conversations. She told Dylan flat out that he could only visit during specific hours with hospital staff watching, which made him jump up from his chair so fast it fell over. He kept saying he was the father, he had rights, but Gita stayed calm and explained this was about keeping everyone safe while things were still so heated. The security guard who'd been hanging around since the courthouse thing took Dylan's picture with his phone, and I saw him adding it to some kind of watch list on his computer. Dylan's face got redder with each new rule Gita laid out, his hands opening and closing like he wanted to grab something, but there was nothing to grab. Later that night, after I finally got home, I couldn't stop myself from checking Facebook and Twitter, and my stomach dropped when I saw 3 different videos of Dylan punching the wall at the courthouse already going viral. The comments were brutal, hundreds of people calling him an abuser and a psycho, though some guys were defending him saying they'd lose it too if their wife named their kid after an ex. One video had over 50,000 views already, and you could see me clearly in the frame looking scared out of my mind while Dylan screamed about Levi. My phone buzzed around midnight with a text from Dylan that made my blood run cold. He said I destroyed his family, and he was thinking about suing me for emotional distress, claiming I conspired with Violet to humiliate him in public on purpose. I screenshotted everything immediately and didn't text back, but I laid there staring at the ceiling for hours, wondering if maybe he was right about me being partly to blame for all this mess. The next morning, my phone was blowing up with messages from our friend group, everyone picking sides like this was some kind of team sport. Half of them thought Violet was cruel for the name thing. The other half said Dylan's reaction proved she was right to hide it from him in the first place. I realized this wasn't just about their marriage anymore. It had become this huge thing that was splitting our whole social circle apart. Violet called me that afternoon asking if I could go to their house and get some stuff from her closet, specific things she needed but couldn't get herself. Walking into their house felt so weird, like stepping into a museum of what their life was supposed to be. The nursery hit me the hardest with Luna spelled out in perfect wooden letters above the crib, stars and moons Dylan had painted by hand covering the walls, tiny clothes all washed and folded in the dresser drawers. This room was supposed to be filled with happiness, not turned into evidence of everything that went wrong. I went to Violet's closet and started looking for the stuff she wanted, pushing past winter coats to reach the back where she said her jewelry box was. That's when I found a shoebox hidden behind everything else, and when I opened it, my hands started shaking. There were photos of Levi everywhere, his funeral program, love letters he'd written her, and at the bottom, a pregnancy test with a date on it from from 2 months after he died. My brain started doing math I didn't want to do, questions forming that I didn't want answers to. I called Violet to ask what exactly she wanted me to bring, and she just broke down completely on the phone. She admitted she never really dealt with Levi dying before she met Dylan, thought she could just move on and build a new life. But when she was in labor and saw the baby for the first time, everything about Levi came flooding back and she couldn't stop it. She sounded so lost and broken, crying so hard I could barely understand her words. 2 days later, Dylan showed up at the hospital carrying flowers and an envelope from his lawyer about custody and changing the baby's name legally. Gita intercepted him in the hallway before he could get to Violet's room, and they disappeared into her office for over an hour while Violet fed the baby, both of us pretending we couldn't hear Dylan's raised voice through the walls. Later, Gita came back and told us Dylan was looking at his legal options, but seemed open to trying mediation first if Violet would agree to it. Someone I didn't even know forwarded me a screenshot that night of an email Dylan had sent to the hospital administration. He was claiming Violet had postpartum psychosis and shouldn't be allowed to make any legal decisions about the baby, and he'd attached all these articles about hormones after birth and how women can't think straight. The administration had forwarded it to Gita for review, which meant now there was an official record of Dylan trying to have Violet declared mentally unfit. Gita scheduled separate meetings with both of them the next day, bringing in some patient advocate I'd never seen before to help establish boundaries and expectations. She explained that Dylan had parental rights, but Violet had medical privacy rights as a patient in the hospital, and they needed to find some middle ground for the baby's sake, even if they couldn't stand each other right now. The advocate took notes while Gita laid out a visitation schedule, communication rules, and what would happen if either of them violated the agreements they were making. The next afternoon, I went back to the hospital and found Dylan standing in the hallway outside Violet's room. He was pressed against the glass window watching Violet hold the baby, his palms flat against the wall on either side. His shoulders were shaking, and when he turned to look at me, his eyes were red and swollen. He pointed through the window at them, and his mouth moved, but no words came out at first. Then he grabbed my arm and pulled me closer to the glass, pointing at how Violet was looking at the baby with this soft expression. He kept tapping the window and mouthing something about being erased, about not existing anymore. The way his face twisted up made me realize this wasn't just about him being controlling. He really felt like that dead guy had replaced him in his own daughter's life. Later that evening, Violet finally told me what happened during labor while the nurse changed the baby's diaper. She said when the pain got really bad, she had this clear memory of Levi talking about wanting kids someday. She could hear his voice, so clearly it was like he was right there in the delivery room with her. The grief hit her so hard she couldn't breathe, and when the nurse handed her the form, she just wrote his name without thinking. She kept saying she didn't plan it, didn't mean to hurt Dylan, it just happened. Her hands were shaking as she explained, and tears kept rolling down her face. That night, Dylan sent me screenshots of dozens of text messages between him and Violet from the past 9 months. They'd spent hours picking out Luna Marie as the perfect name, talking about what it meant, how it sounded with their last name. There were photos of them at a baby store looking at items with Luna on them, messages where Violet said she loved the name, couldn't wait to meet baby Luna. The dates on everything showed they'd been planning this for months, not just some casual conversation. He'd highlighted every time Violet agreed to the name Luna in yellow marker on the screenshots. At the bottom, he'd typed that this proved she'd lied to him on purpose, that she'd been planning this betrayal the whole time. 2 days later, Violet's mom, Narissa, showed up from 3 states away carrying 2 suitcases and immediately started in on Violet about the name situation. She stood over Violet's hospital bed, waving her hands around, saying this was insane, that she needed to fix this mess right now for the baby's sake. She kept saying Dylan was a good man who didn't deserve this treatment. Violet just stared at the wall and wouldn't respond to anything her mom said. Narissa turned to me, asking if I could talk sense into her daughter, but I just shrugged because I didn't know what to say. She started pacing around the small room, muttering about how her generation would never pull something like this. 3 days after the birth, they finally discharged Violet, and I drove her and baby Levi home, while Dylan followed in his car behind us. Violet sat in the back seat next to the car seat, her hand gripping the handle so tight her knuckles were white. She kept checking the side mirror to make sure Dylan was still following us. Dylan's lawyer move while bringing flowers feels like such a mixed message. Is he trying to look caring while threatening legal action? The timing of that emotional breakdown by the window makes me wonder if his anger's been covering up deeper hurt this whole time. Nobody said anything the whole 20-minute drive. The baby slept the entire time while we all sat there drowning in the silence. I could feel the tension like a physical weight pressing down on all of us. When we pulled into their driveway, Violet's breathing got faster, and she started saying she couldn't do this. At the house, Violet walked to the nursery doorway and just froze when she saw everything Dylan had made. The wooden letters spelling Luna were painted in soft pink above the crib. There was a moon-shaped mobile hanging down with little stars dangling from silver strings. A blanket with Luna embroidered in cursive was folded perfectly in the crib. Violet's whole body started shaking, and she made this choking sound while still holding the baby. Her mom rushed over trying to take the baby, but Violet's arms were locked tight around the carrier. I had to physically pry her fingers off one by one so Narissa could take the baby to the living room. Violet collapsed against the doorframe, gasping for air while Narissa dug through her purse for a paper bag. We got Violet breathing into the bag while the baby started crying in the other room. Dylan pulled up outside and walked to the front door, but Violet scrambled to lock it before he could turn the handle. He started knocking and calling out that he lived here too, that she couldn't keep him out of his own house. Violet slid down the door crying while Dylan's knocking got louder. He pulled out his phone and called Gita right there on the porch, putting it on speaker so we could all hear. Gita's calm voice came through, asking what was happening, and Dylan started explaining how he was locked out, how this was his house that he paid for. Gita asked to talk to Violet too, and after some back and forth, she worked out that Dylan could visit the baby, but Violet needed space to recover from surgery. Dylan argued that he had nowhere to go, but Gita reminded him about the agreements they'd just signed. He ended up sleeping in in his car in the driveway that night while we watched through the curtains. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a photo from Dylan showing the empty crib in the nursery with all the Luna decorations visible. His message said he couldn't even hold his daughter in the room he'd built for her with his own hands. An hour later, he texted that he was packing a bag and going to stay with his brother Todd until this got sorted out. We watched from the window as he loaded 2 suitcases into his trunk and drove away without looking back at the house. Later that day, I tried suggesting to Violet that maybe they could call the baby Lee as a nickname since it was close to both names. Violet actually looked interested for a second and started to text Dylan about it. His response came back fast and harsh, saying her name was Luna or nothing, that he wouldn't accept any form of that dead guy's name. The compromise died right there before it even had a chance. 2 days later, Dylan called Violet and they got into it bad on the phone. I could hear him yelling through the speaker from across the room. He said maybe she wasn't even sure he was really the father. Maybe that's why she'd done this. He took it back immediately, but Violet had already hung up on him. She looked at me with this expression of complete shock and said she couldn't believe she'd married someone who could even think that about her. She started pulling off her wedding ring, but her finger was still swollen from the pregnancy, so it wouldn't come off. She kept twisting and pulling at the ring while tears ran down her face. 3 days later, we were at the pediatrician's office for the baby's first checkup. The waiting room was full of happy families with their newborns while Violet sat alone holding the carrier. The nurse called us back and started taking the baby's measurements, writing everything down on her clipboard. When she asked for the baby's name, Violet whispered, Levi, and started crying again. The nurse typed it into the computer without saying anything, but I saw her eyebrows go up. She kept glancing at Violet while checking the baby's weight and length. The doctor came in and did the exam, listening to the baby's heart and checking her reflexes. Everything looked good physically, but he kept watching Violet's face during the appointment. After we left, Violet turned to me in the parking lot and said maybe she'd made a terrible mistake. She said it was too late to fix anything now. Her phone buzzed with a text from Dylan asking if he could see me. I didn't want to go, but something in his message seemed different, less angry and more desperate. The next morning, I met him at a coffee shop downtown where he was already waiting in a back corner booth. His face looked terrible with dark circles under his eyes and stubble he hadn't shaved in days. He pushed a laptop across the table toward me without even saying hello first. The screen showed Violet's browser history from the past month with dozens of visits to the same Facebook page. It was Levi's memorial page that his mother maintained with photos and memories. Violet had been visiting it every single day, sometimes multiple times, leaving comments on posts from his family. She'd written things about missing him and wishing he could meet their baby. Dylan scrolled down, showing me comment after comment where Violet talked to Levi's mother like they were still close. There were private messages too where they discussed the pregnancy and Violet's feelings about becoming a mother. She'd never mentioned any of this ongoing connection to Dylan or even to me. Dylan's hands shook as he showed me timestamps proving she'd been on the page even during labor. He said the deception went way deeper than just the name choice. He'd found emails where Violet had asked Levi's mother for baby name suggestions months ago. The whole time she'd been pretending to plan with Dylan, she was secretly planning something else entirely. I pushed the laptop back and told him I couldn't keep doing this anymore. My own mental health was falling apart from being stuck between them. I cared about them both, but they needed to figure this out themselves or get professional help. Dylan nodded and said Geeta had already given them a referral to someone named Adam Nash. He was a therapist who specialized in couples with newborns going through high conflict situations. Both of them had agreed to go, though Dylan wanted separate sessions at first. A week later, I drove them both to the medical building where Adam's office was located. Dylan went in first, while Violet and I waited in the lobby with the baby. After an hour, he came out with his face all red, but he seemed calmer somehow. Violet went in next, handing me the baby carrier before disappearing down the hallway. She came out crying, but there was something lighter about how she moved. Neither of them told me what they'd talked about, but both agreed to keep going. The next day, Adam emailed them both summaries of their sessions with key points highlighted. Dylan showed me his, which talked about fear of being replaced and his need for control. Violet's mentioned unprocessed grief and postpartum vulnerability, making everything harder. Seeing their pain written out in clinical terms seemed to help them understand this was bigger than stubbornness. At their next joint session, Adam explained the legal reality about changing birth certificates. Without both parents agreeing, it would need a court order which could take months and cost thousands. He suggested they focus on emotional healing first before tackling the legal stuff. Dylan struggled with this timeline but eventually agreed to try. Later that week, Violet texted Dylan offering to add Luna as a middle name. The baby would be Levi Luna Torres, honoring both the name they'd planned and her feelings. Dylan immediately rejected this, saying it still put the dead boyfriend first. Every compromise attempt just seemed to make things worse between them. Narissa pulled me aside and said they were both being stubborn while the baby was suffering. She thought they should just pick a completely different name and start fresh, but neither Violet nor Dylan would even consider that option. Monday morning, I went back to work for the first time in 2 weeks. I sat at my desk but couldn't focus on anything, constantly checking my phone for crisis texts. My computer screen blurred as I kept thinking about everything that had happened. My boss came by and asked if everything was okay since I'd been so absent lately. I ended up telling her the whole story about the birth certificate and the courthouse scene. She listened quietly, then handed me a brochure for employee assistance counseling. She said I looked traumatized myself and needed to talk to someone professional about it. I took the brochure and realized she was right about me needing help too. That afternoon, my phone started blowing up with calls from numbers I didn't recognize. Dylan's mom left me a voicemail saying I should have known better than to enable Violet's cruelty and that I'd helped destroy her son's life. His sister texted me screenshots of Dylan's Facebook posts about the name situation with comments from their family calling me an accomplice. I blocked 4 different numbers, but the messages kept coming through mutual friends who were suddenly taking sides. My Instagram got flooded with angry DMs from people I'd never even met, all blaming me for not stopping Violet at the courthouse. The social fallout was spreading faster faster than I could contain it, making me realize how many people Dylan had told his version to. Meanwhile, Geeta showed up at Violet's house with assessment forms and spent 2 hours evaluating her mental state. She asked Violet detailed questions about sleep patterns, appetite changes, intrusive thoughts, and bonding with the baby while taking notes on her clipboard. Violet scored moderate on the postpartum depression scale, which Geeta said wasn't unusual but needed treatment. The way Dylan's digging through Violet's browser history makes me wonder if he's looking for proof of something he already suspects deep down. Finding those daily visits to Levi's memorial page, that's a pretty big secret to keep from your husband, isn't it? She made phone calls right there in the living room and got Violet an appointment with a psychiatrist who specialized in new mothers. The doctor prescribed medication that was safe for breastfeeding and set up weekly therapy sessions starting immediately. Dylan found out about the diagnosis through his lawyer and immediately started telling everyone Violet had postpartum psychosis, not just depression. Adam had to send him an email explaining the clinical difference between the two conditions and warning him against making false medical claims in any legal proceedings. Dylan backed off but kept bringing up Violet's mental health in every conversation about custody arrangements. 3 days later, I found myself sitting in a circle of folding chairs at a community center listening to strangers talk about their divorces. The support group leader had suggested I come even though Violet and Dylan weren't technically divorced yet. A woman named Patricia was crying about how her husband left over her spending habits, while a man named Carlos talked about losing his kids over a DUI. Everyone had these devastating stories about families falling apart over issues that seemed fixable from the outside. One couple split because they couldn't agree on private versus public school for their kids. Another marriage ended when the wife's mother moved in without discussion. Hearing all these stories made me realize how common these sudden breaks really were, and how small triggers could destroy years of love. Nothing about Violet and Dylan's situation was unique except the specific detail of naming their baby after a dead ex. The group gave me perspective, but also made everything feel more hopeless, because if marriages could end over school choices, what chance did Violet and Dylan have? That weekend, Dylan signed a lease on a 1-bedroom apartment 3 blocks from his brother Todd's place. He sent Violet photos of him assembling a second crib in the corner of his bedroom with plain white sheets and no decorations. The walls were bare except for a calendar marking his custody days once they got established. He'd bought duplicate baby supplies like bottles, diapers, and clothes, so he wouldn't have to transfer stuff between houses. The photos showed this sad little setup that looked nothing like the beautiful nursery he'd painted with stars and moons. Violet cried looking at the pictures because it meant he'd accepted they weren't going to work things out anytime soon. The parallel households felt like admitting defeat without actually saying the words out loud. 5 days later came the first official custody handoff in the hospital parking lot, where Geeta had agreed to supervise. Dylan hadn't held the baby in over a week, and his hands were shaking when Violet passed her over. He counted each tiny finger and toe while tears ran down his face, whispering something I couldn't hear. Violet watched from her car with her face pressed against the window, also crying as Dylan walked around the parking lot rocking the baby. Geeta stood between them taking notes and making sure neither parent said anything inflammatory. The handoff took 20 minutes but felt like hours with all the tension and sadness radiating from both parents. When Dylan finally gave the baby back, he kissed her forehead 3 times before walking to his car without looking at Violet. 2 days after that, the mail carrier needed a signature for a certified letter that turned out to be the official birth certificate. Dylan happened to be there picking up some tools from the garage when Violet opened it at the kitchen table. The government seal and official formatting made Levi Torres look so permanent and real, printed in black ink. Dylan stood frozen in the doorway staring at the document for a full minute without moving or breathing. Then he turned around and walked out without saying a single word, got in his car, and drove away. Violet texted him over and over asking if he was okay, but he didn't respond for 2 whole days. When he finally surfaced, he just sent a 1-line text saying he needed space to process. The silence was somehow worse than the fighting had been. 3 days into that awful quiet, Adam called me to say Dylan had agreed to start anger management classes and asked if I could tell Violet since Dylan wasn't ready to talk to her directly yet. I drove to Violet's house and found her sitting on the couch staring at nothing while the baby slept in her bassinet, and when I told her about the classes, she just nodded like she'd expected it. That first week, Dylan went to 2 sessions, and afterwards he'd text Violet these short updates like, "Went to group today," or "Therapist says I'm making progress." And even though the messages were basic, Violet would read them over and over like they were love letters. The anger management place was in a strip mall between a nail salon and a tax office, and I saw Dylan's car there when I drove past on Thursday, which somehow made the whole thing feel more real than all the legal threats had. During the second week, Geeta arranged a supervised visit at the hospital family center, where Dylan could see the baby for an hour with a social worker watching, and I went with Violet for support, even though my stomach was in knots the whole drive there. Dylan was already waiting in the bright yellow room full of toys when we arrived, and he stood up so fast his chair scraped against the floor, his eyes locked on the baby carrier Violet was holding. The social worker, a young woman with a clipboard, reminded everyone about the rules while Dylan kept staring at his daughter like he was trying to memorize her face, and when Violet finally handed her over, his whole body started shaking. He walked around the room holding her and talking softly, calling her sweetheart and my little one, but never using either name, and Violet sat in the corner chair watching them with tears running down her face. When the hour was up, Dylan kissed the baby's forehead about 10 times before giving her back, and he and Violet made eye contact for maybe 2 seconds before he turned and left without saying anything. That night, my phone buzzed with a text from Dylan, the first time he'd contacted me since the courthouse, and it just said, "I'm sorry for what happened and the things I said, you were trying to help, and got caught in the middle. I was wrong to blame you." I stared at that message for 20 minutes not knowing how to respond, finally just sending back thank you, because what else was there to say? And even though it wasn't some big reconciliation, I felt like I could breathe a little easier. The next week at the baby's 1-month checkup, I went along because Violet was nervous about running into Dylan Dylan there, but they'd scheduled separate appointments and the receptionist had started writing Baby L. Torres on the forms instead of either full name. The pediatrician didn't comment on the weird paperwork, just examined the baby and said she was healthy and gaining weight perfectly. And I noticed Violet had started calling her baby girl instead of Levi when talking to the doctor. After that appointment, my boss pulled me aside at work and said she'd noticed I seemed stressed and reminded me about the employee counseling program, practically pushing the brochure into my hands and saying I should really consider it. I made an appointment mostly to get her off my back, but sitting in that therapist's office talking about everything that had happened, I started crying and couldn't stop for the whole session. The therapist, an older man with kind eyes, helped me see that I'd been carrying around guilt about the courthouse, about not warning Dylan, about being the one holding that envelope when everything exploded, even though none of it was really my fault. He gave me homework to practice saying no and setting boundaries, which seemed stupid until I tried it and realized how hard it was for me to tell Violet I couldn't come over one night because I needed to do my own laundry and sleep. 2 weeks after that, Adam got Dylan and Violet to agree to a joint session where they sat on opposite ends of a couch, while he talked about focusing on the baby's needs instead of their own pain, and they both signed papers agreeing to stop all legal proceedings for 90 days. They worked out a basic schedule where Dylan would get the baby every other weekend and Wednesday evenings, with pickups and drop-offs happening at Gita's office so they wouldn't have to see each other, and even though it wasn't perfect, it was something. A month into this new routine, I met Violet at the park near her house where she was pushing the baby in a stroller, getting out of the house for the first time in weeks, and she looked tired but calmer somehow. She told me that she and Dylan had managed a phone call about the baby's feeding schedule without it turning into a fight, and they'd even agreed on which formula to use when she stopped breastfeeding, which felt like a miracle after everything. Standing there watching her push that stroller around the walking path, talking about normal baby stuff like sleep schedules and diaper brands, I realized something important. I hadn't destroyed their marriage by filing that birth certificate. I was just the person holding the envelope when years of Dylan's control issues crashed into Violet's unprocessed grief about Levi, creating an explosion that was always going to happen somehow. They're both in therapy now. Dylan working on his anger and need to control everything. Violet dealing with the grief she'd buried when Levi died, and they're slowly learning to be parents even if they'll never be husband and wife again. The baby doesn't know about any of this drama. She just knows that sometimes she's with mommy and sometimes with daddy, and both of them love her even if they can't agree on her name. Everyone's moving forward in their own messy way, going to therapy and setting boundaries and trying to heal, and maybe that's the best outcome anyone could hope for after something this devastating. Thanks for letting me wonder along with you all during this story. It's definitely been quite the journey to share together. Until next time. And hey, like the video. It helps more than you think.